So again, we had been having a discussion on Discord a bit today about how do you get started as a healer, and there's some follow-on questions. I wanted to make a little bit more detailed guide uh, in terms of how do you get started as a healer. There's plenty of end game guides. I mean, you look at Outcast; he's got some great builds, etc. But I don't think there's a lot in game that talks about how do you get started, what does the leveling experience look like, what kind of gear should you use, etc. So I wanted to make a real brief video about that to follow up on some of the questions that we had in Discord today. So let's talk about several things. First is, what is the healer's role? And if you come from another MMO, that might seem like an obvious question, right? It's just to keep everybody alive in your group or in your trial or your raid. And in Elder Scrolls, it's a little bit more complicated. So your role as a healer, of course, is to keep everyone alive primarily. However, you're also responsible for debuffing the boss, for resource management for your group, and for buffing your group. So this is one of the things where when you get started as a healer, particularly if you do pick up groups, that expectations can be mismanaged, right? I did this a lot early on. I leveled as a healer on this character, and I'd just spam my heals, and that was kind of it. I'd throw in a little DPS when I could afterwards, but I don't think I really understood all the responsibilities that the healer had in the game. So that might be a little bit intimidating, I think, for folks who are just getting started. My suggestion, as always, would be, run as a healer with guild groups. People are a lot more understanding, much more willing to help you learn. If you run in pure pickup groups, I think there's a number of challenges, right? One is the concept that anybody can run in any group, regardless of whether they're max level or not. So you get these players who are 810 champion points and just want to kind of rush through the thing, may not even need a healer. There's a concept called fake tanks, which we'll talk about a little bit, which is, look, if you're learning how to tank, don't consider yourself a fake tank. You're a real tank. If you're slotting a taunt, if you have the right type of gear, then you're a tank. Fake tank in ESO means somebody who wants to skip the queue. They're still a DPS, they're wearing DPS gear, but they just want to skip the queue by queuing as a tank. So I had a lot of trouble with this in my early days as a healer, because all of a sudden I'm noticing this guy who's supposed to be the tank is just taking massive amounts of damage, and I'm spamming my big heals on this person over and over again. I didn't know at the time that was what a fake tank was. It's just a DPS who's decided to skip the queue as a tank. And it really causes a lot of headaches because they normally don't have a taunt slotted, so mobs run all over the place, and it makes the healer's life much more difficult. So when we talk about fake tanks, that's what that means specifically. Let's talk briefly about the leveling experience, right? So it is very difficult to quest as a healer. You also don't do a lot of damage. Clearly, you have healing skills that don't help you in terms of finishing quests. So what do people do? In general, you will level as a DPS, as a Magicka DPS, and then change your skills and your gear when you want to heal. So there's some nuance to this. You can start queuing for dungeons at level 10. So if you level up from 1 to 10 as a DPS, the challenge you're going to have is you're not going to have any restoration staff experience, no restoration staff skills. You might have a couple of heals off of your class lines, but that's going to be it. So you're going to be a little bit challenged up front. If you try to level from 1 to 10 as a healer, it's just going to be kind of a long row to hoe. You're going to have a lot of trouble killing mobs with just using your restoration staff. You won't get a restoration staff right out of the gate either. You'd have to craft one yourself or have someone craft one for you. So it's a little bit difficult as you get up to level 10. What you can do is equip the restoration staff so you're building up that skill line, and then slot your class damage skills, right? So for example, here I'm on a Templar. You could slot your puncturing sweeps. You could, you probably won't have Blazing Spear that early, but certainly puncturing sweeps. And from Dawn's Wrath, you'll have Sunfire, which then becomes Vampire's Bane. So you have some access to DPS skills that you can use from levels 1 to 10. At level 15, when you open up your back bar, then things get more interesting, right? You can have a front bar damage or back bar damage, and then on the other bar have your restoration staff. So what folks normally do is they keep their destruction staff on the main bar, do that for most questing, but then when you go to turn in your quest, switch real quick to your restoration staff bar, because you level up based on any experience you get. So the experience that you get killing mobs, you'll get on your destruction staff. But when you turn in your quest, all of the skills that are on your restoration bar, so you see them here at the bottom. I'm on my restoration bar right now, right? These are all healing skills. Those will get experience and you'll level them up if you just turn in quests on that bar. So whatever bar you're on when you turn in your quest, that's where the experience goes and that's what levels up. So that's certainly one of the easier ways to do it to level up is to keep one of each staff and just level up that way. It certainly will carry you through probably through level 50. Um, let's talk a little bit about leveling gear and leveling stats, right? So in general, what you want to do is when you look at your stats, you want everything in Magicka. Um, a lot of people put points in health, particularly when they're new to the game, because they die too easily. If you're dying too easily, it's probably because you're not eating food. Most of the time, you should have a food buff of some kind. You get that food from the crown crates, which is pretty good. Not the crates, I mean from the daily rewards as well. So that's pretty good food if you can have it. Otherwise, you can craft low-level food. You can find some lying around in the world. Oddly enough, crusty bread that you find all over the place is a pretty good health food. And you really should not have any points in stamina, right? We were talking a little bit earlier about, hey, can I have a bow as a healer? Sure, you can. This is Greymanes. You can play however you want. But what we're talking about here is kind of, leaning towards best practices. So your bow skills, if you have them, are going to be based off your stamina pool. Your healing skills are going to be based off Magicka. So really what we would consider a better practice would be if you're going to level, use the DPS line from your Magicka skills, use a Inferno or Lightning staff as your damage staff, and then use a Restoration staff to level your Restoration skills. Keeping everything in Magicka, just everything will work together a little bit better than trying to split across and have a hybrid of some Magicka and some stamina. So staves, whether the destruction or resto, always use Magicka. All other weapons use stamina. So a two-handed sword with a resto staff. I mean, there's PvP builds that have that kind of thing. But if you're trying to just level as a PvE healer, you certainly want to go with the all Magicka. Let's talk about gear briefly. So again, similar to the points in having points in Magicka, you probably want to be in light armor. So that just got really loud. I'm not sure if it got loud for you all or not. Let's go ahead and mute ourselves a little bit. Apologies for that. You want to use light armor, right? Because you get some skills in the light armor line. It increases your Magicka recovery, increases your spell resistance. When you have 5 or more, increases your spell critical rating and your spell penetration rating. So those are all good skills to have. And the medium armor ones, you'll notice, just don't apply as much. All right, it's weapon damage, which does not apply to us. Movement speed bonus of sprint doesn't apply to us, etc. So actually, it does apply to us, but Windwalker stamina recovery doesn't really apply to us as healers that much. So you want to be in mostly light armor. You'll notice that the bonuses are very much attuned to being a healer or a Magicka DPS. So when we look at our gear, right now, which is a very nice bonus to have, and I'm also running Sanctuary, which increases healing received for the whole group. So these both leveling as a Magicka DPS as well as a healer. Another one that's very common as you level up would be Magnus's. So Magnus again has maximum Magicka and a proc that will let you negate the cost of the ability. So Magnus is very nice. Again, these are very early, easy craftable sets, so only anyone in the guild can craft them for you. Or you could pretty much use any kind of dropped light set from wherever you happen to be questing. An interesting one that I just kind of came across, Winter's Respite from the new Greymoor expansion. This actually looks like an okay healer set. Magicka Recovery, Maximum Magicka, those are all good. And then it can leave a healing circle on the ground, which, hey, you know, extra healing is always good. So that one you just get from questing in the Greymoor zones. So that's kind of an interesting approach. So let's talk a little bit about the skills that you will level up as a healer. When we talk about skills, you've got to talk about classes, right? So which classes are better healers? Again, we're the Grey Mains. Do whatever you want, and anything will work within our guild. That being said, there are some classes that are a little bit better at healing than others. I would put Templars, Necromancers, and Wardens as kind of top rank healers, because they each have a healing class line that gives you some additional skills and additional passives. Sorcerers, Dragon Knights, and Nightblades can certainly be healers. It's just not as easy for them to do so. They don't have some of these class specific skills and passives to help them out. Templars have a very nice set of skills and a very nice set of passives that make them outstanding healers. So the other thing that we will take is you will normally be using a restoration staff. Is it possible to heal without a restoration staff? Sure. But restoration staff really makes things much easier on you, and there are skills in here that will frankly be expected of you as a healer as you kind of grow into the game. So you can kind of mix and match. You'll notice I actually run a lot of skills just directly off of the restoration staff. I run Radiating Regeneration. It's a heal over time for 3 people at a time, which is very nice. 15,000, almost 16,000 points over 10 seconds. Very nice heal over time. Combat Prayer we're going to talk about more in a little bit. This is you slam your staff down and it's a heal in a cone directly in front of you. But it also gives a buff to the DPS, which is very important. Healing Springs is a zone, right? So you put down a circle of healing. It's okay a lot of the time, but frankly, a lot of the time you have to move around, and people will walk out of the circle, and they don't stand in the circle. So that can be a little bit problematic in some fights. And then I use Breath of Life, which is just a big single target heal with a little bit of splash healing. That's you know, when somebody's taking a big hit, that's the one that I go to. You know, when I had that fake tank, this is what I was spamming over and over, trying to keep that person alive. We talked a little bit about, you know, grouping in the guild versus pickup groups and what's expected of you when you're in a pickup group, and we're going to talk about some of these support functions. But you know, one of the things to know is as you level up, the power curve of dungeons you go to can actually change radically as you advance. So once the dungeons that are number 2 start opening up to you, so if we look over here on Dungeon Finder, if we pick a specific dungeon, right, so you got Spindle Clutch 1, Spindle Clutch 2, Banish Souls 1 and 2, etc. So in the 2s, which get more difficult than the 1s, there may be mechanics that require you as a healer to perform at a certain level. And this is, you know, when I ran into trouble when I was leveling up a little bit, which is particularly Darkshade Caverns 2, right? The final boss there has a poison phase where he poisons the whole room. Well, if you stand in the middle of the room, there's 4 levers that you can throw and turn off the poison. Well, nobody does that anymore because they just expect the healer to blow all their cooldowns and over-heal the group and keep everybody alive. Well, if you don't know that as a healer, it's a bad day, and that was a miserable experience for me. And you know, this dungeon actually opens up pretty early as you level up. So as you get into these, trying to do just a random normal dungeon every day, you will start getting some of these 2s. They can have mechanics that are a little bit more problematic, and I think, you know, if you do them as a guild, there'll be folks who are willing to kind of teach you how to do it and be a little bit more patient with you, I think, than perhaps most pickup groups. So just something to be aware of there. And certainly as you get into veteran versus normal, the difficulty curve ramps up significantly. Not to dissuade you, do whatever you guys like, obviously, as we do in Grammys, but pickup groups can tend to be a little bit less patient than average, and certainly much less patient than our guild groups. I'm not sure we finished talking about gear. The other one that I wanted to talk about real briefly, that's kind of a mainstay early on that I use for leveling a lot, is Julianos. Spell critical, maximum magicka, spell critical, and spell damage. So why is this an okay healer set? Again, as opposed to some other MMOs, because there are no stats that are specific to healing versus doing damage, spell critical and spell damage actually translate into healing critical and healing effectiveness. Those same numbers are used to compute your total healing done when you're casting a healing spell. So it just kind of happens automatically for you. There are no separate heal stats. So any magic set technically can be used as a healing set. So that's why as you level up, just using kind of whatever you find in the zones that is light armor is going to work for you pretty well until you get to the point where you want to have dedicated healing sets. Always be asking guild, because folks are more than willing to craft Julianos and Seducers and Magnus. Newman Acolyte maybe would be another that's very popular now. That's kind of a general purpose set. There's all kinds of sets that can be crafted for you or that can fall from overland mobs that will be useful as a healer. I think that's it on gear. To say, here's my setup, right? So restoration staff on the front bar, on the back bar, lightning staff. You definitely want to have a lightning staff on the back bar once you get into kind of the debuffing part of doing your job as a healer. So let's talk about kind of these extended roles of the healer a little bit. So we talked about how do I heal folk, right? So I just I can cast my regeneration spell. I can cast my healing springs, which gives that little area that we saw, etc. So that's the primary healing thing, right? I mean, I'm kind of keeping my group healed. So let's see, this is our fake group here, right? So Dave here in the middle is going to be our boss. And then over here, this will be the tank. And here, the banker and the merchant are our additional DPS. So this is normally how you want to kind of position yourself. You want to have you want to be behind the DPS so that your heals that are conical in front of you will always hit them wherever so they're always in front of you when you cast them. Otherwise, you're going to waste the cast, particularly combat prayer, which we'll talk about in a second. So, okay, so we talked about number one, keeping folks alive, right? So I have 4 spells dedicated on my bar to keeping people alive. What else do we do as healers? We're responsible for people's resources, right? So, for example, right here at Blazing Spear, it's a damage skill, but it also creates a synergy. You've seen those perhaps when you play. You could hit X and cause a synergy to happen, which will restore magicka or stamina, whichever is higher for that player. So this will restore stamina and magicka to your DPS and your tank. Particularly for your tank, it's very important. So when I'm talking about my role as preserving the group's resources, this is what we're talking about. By using Blazing Spear, I'm helping them manage their resources. On my front bar, I've actually got a similar one. It comes from the Undaunted skill line, which is here in Guild, Undaunted. Energy Orb. So it does a little bit of healing, but then they can use the Combustion Synergy, which will do a healing and restores resources as well. So either one of those would be helpful. You get this just by leveling up the Undaunted skill line in dungeons. You can actually start that at level 1 if you do the Undaunted quest. You start getting experience for doing dungeons, and this levels up pretty quickly. Let's see what else we have going on here in terms of skills. The other big one here is Blockade of Storms, right? This is why I have a lightning staff on the back bar. It's a damage skill, but it puts enemies off balance, which means they take more damage from DPS. So you're helping your DPS by keeping this Blockade of Storms down on all the enemies. Similarly, Elemental Drain. You can put it on a single target to give them major breach, so it reduces their spell resistance. And again, it helps everybody do more damage. So now we've talked about kind of all of the functions of the healer, right? We heal folk, we help them manage their resources, we debuff the boss. Well, actually, there's one more, and we buff our team, which we'll talk about next. So when we talk about buffing our team, let's look at Combat Prayer again. This cone heal does a pretty decent heal. It's just a nice one to kind of drop when you need it. It's pretty cheap. But the interesting thing is it gives minor Berserk and minor Resolve. So it increases physical and spell resistance, and helps the team do more damage as well. I think is what minor Berserk ends up doing. So keeping this down actually helps the DPS do more DPS. The last buff that we're going to talk about is Aggressive Warhorn, which comes from actually doing PvP, which is a little bit unfortunate, but it's pretty early on. You get it, I guess, at level 4 or 5 in PvP, which is not awful to get. I mean, you get to level 2 just by doing the intro quest that gives you rapid riding anyways. So you definitely want to do that. And as a healer, you actually have a little bit of an easier time in PvP, because you can just kind of follow the Zerg and spam your heals, and you will get experience in PvP just by doing that stuff. So healers have, I think, some of the easier time in leveling up on PvP. You can also do Battlegrounds if that's your thing. But this Aggressive Warhorn will increase max magic and max stamina, and give you the Major Force buff. So those are very nice. So we've talked about all the things that the healer does, and you'll notice it's not quite as straightforward as you may think, right? You're not just sitting there spamming heals and making sure everybody's alive. You have other things that at the end of the day, when you're fully, you have all your skills and are maximizing your role as a healer, you'll be wanting to do all 4 of these roles. So the way that would kind of work is, when we start, you'll notice see how these things work. So if that's our group, the reason we want our DPS in front of it is specifically for Combat Prayer, right? So I drop Combat Prayer, you can kind of see it go through there. So now they're getting the buff for their DPS, and they're getting healed by it. You won't see it because these are NPCs, obviously. So, we throw a Combat Prayer, we can throw our Regeneration in there whenever it's needed. If folks are pretty... that was actually my monster set that activated right there. And then through Healing Springs, right? So we can kind of see the area in which Healing Springs will heal folk. This should heal me while I'm standing in it. If folks are standing still, this is a pretty good heal. When I talked about Darkshade Caverns too, this would be what I should have done in that boss's poison phase, right? If we're all clustered together, drop a Healing Springs, perhaps even use a Healing Ultimate, and keep everybody alive. For folks to restore resources, right? Again, I want to stand behind them, because then I can do something like this and make the orb pass through them. They can activate the synergy for healing, and then they can restore resources. You always want to hit the tank with those, or hit the tank with when you cast spears, and that's going to start this fight, because then that tank can restore resources right there. I can cast my Elemental Drain on the boss, so he's now more vulnerable, and then I can put down my wall Elemental Blockade, which again puts everybody off balance and makes everybody do more damage. So there's not really a rotation for healers, but you will kind of do stuff like that, right? As stuff's actually expiring. I want to keep shards down, I want to keep blockade down, I want to keep combat prayer down, and then make sure people are staying topped off with heals. And as soon as possible, I want to keep firing my orbs in there. It's kind of an either or between the orbs and the shards, the spears. So you can do whichever one you like. Not all classes have it, so depending on your class, you might have different things going. But trying to keep these debuffs up. Now, when you're not doing anything else, you can do heavy attacks, right? Which will restore your resources, and through passives can actually generate healing depending on the sets you have. So you want to, be doing heavy attacks when you can, but all your first priority is obviously keep people alive and keep them resourced up. So that's kind of what it looks like, to heal. As you kind of level up, this is kind of what your experience will be. You notice my monster set was kind of ticking there. That's Chokethorn, which does this. So there's several nice when you get to CP 160 monster sets that you could use. As you level up, you obviously won't have those. You can use 2 5-piece sets of whatever. So like Julianos and Seducers, for example. Um, and then you can fill in your other slots with, you could use willpower, for example, or you could just mix and match the stuff that you pick up along the way as you're questing. So I think that's kind of it in terms of, how do you get started healing. It's a little bit more complex